Good. Cool. Well, apparently we're good to go. So, good evening. Um, I apologize for sounding like Batman or Leonard Cohen or something tonight. Um, I just got a sore throat. Want to make it known for when we are open back up that we do have a stack of our study book that we have, Christian History Made Easy, available out here in the lobby. I'm not sure how many we have, but they'll be available to whoever wants to take them. First come, first serve. Um, so with that, perhaps no one in the history of the church was as controversial as Constantine, or Constantine the Great, as some call him. Many consider him to be the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, but that's widely debated among many things debated about Constantine. Many conspiracy theories abound around him as well. The two most common of those being that he only pretended to be a Christian in order to handle the growing threat that Romans believed Christians were becoming, which is likely inaccurate since Christians at this time, around the time that the Edict of Milan was passed, were at most 10% of the population empire wide. So Constantine wouldn't need to fake his conversion to gain Christian support for religious toleration. And then also that he single handedly invented the New Testament canon at the Council of Nicaea, which a surprising number of people believe and stems from the idea that Paul corrupted and paganized or Hellenized the teachings of Jesus when he wrote much of the New Testament. And then Constantine finished that paganization or that Hellenization when he completed the New Testament canon at Nicaea. Constantine was many things besides just being emperor. As I said, professed Christian. He was a patron of the church, defender of the Nicene faith, which is debatable, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the originator, I would say, of the first stages of what we know today as the state church. So let's try to sift through what we know from history and take a look at maybe, again, the most controversial figure in the history of the church. So Constantine, before he converted, was not really much different than any other Roman Empire emperor that had ever come before him, as far as whether it be sacrificing to the pagan gods or fighting wars. I mean, he did have to deal with a few things that past emperors hadn't, namely at this time there was a series of civil wars that were tearing the empire apart. But I mean, aside from that, in terms of his practices and his beliefs, was not much different than any other emperor before him, except for two things specifically. First, as best we can tell by the historical record anyway, Constantine was not just the first Christian emperor, he was also the first emperor to have a Christian parent, namely his mother Helena. And two, Constantine, like his father Constantius I, approved of allowing the Christians to practice their religion, which is why he signed the Edict of Milan in 313 that guaranteed religious toleration for the Christians, and why he got his co-emperor Galerius to sign it as well. And if you remember Galerius from when we talked about persecution, Galerius was the guy who egged on the emperor Diocletian to start what we know as the last great persecution. And then, out of seemingly nowhere, Constantine comes to faith in Christ, or at least professes to come to faith in Christ. And there are several reasons for it, but there are two particular ones that are generally agreed upon as bringing this about. First of all was the faith of his mother, Helena, as I mentioned. Constantine's mother was believed to have been a Christian for many years before his own conversion. And her influence on him in terms of his development in his faith is unquestionable. It's not ultimately the reason behind why he converted, but it is unquestionable. And in her later years, as her son worked to grow the church across the empire, she took a tour of the Holy Land, where tradition tells us, tradition, do with it what you will, tells us that she discovered the true cross on which Jesus was crucified. And so, at her behest, on the site where she's said to have found it, Constantine built the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is still in Jerusalem today. And that first one was the first one was actually built both on the site of the crucifixion at Golgotha, and then also on the site where Jesus was believed to have been buried, so his tomb. The original Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not still there. It was destroyed in 1000 ish and has been rebuilt twice since then. But Helena is considered today to be a saint by Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. So we have Mother Helena, and then we also have the Battle of Milvian Bridge, as it's called, and the Cairo, which is not a city in Egypt, I promise. On the night before what would become the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which was a bridge in northern Italy over the Tiber River, Constantine is said to have had a vision. The church historian Eusebius of Caesarea records this, and he writes, quote, "About the time of the midday sun, when the day was just turning, he said he saw with his own eyes, up in the sky and resting over the sun, a cross-shaped trophy formed from light, and a text attached to it which said, 'In this sign, conquer.' Amazement at the spectacle seized both him and the whole company of soldiers, which was then accompanying him on a campaign he was conducting somewhere, and witnessed the miracle." Tradition tells us that this cross-shaped trophy that Constantine saw, or is said to have seen anyway, is what we know today as the Cairo. And so it's a little dark, but if you can see it, the Cairo was a sign used by the earliest Christians in the Catacomb of Rome to denote the name of Christ, also called a Christogram, and it uses the first two letters of the name Christ in Greek, which the letters Chi, which is an X, and Rho, which is a P, and it makes the Cairo. The X is drawn through the tail of the P to form this. Constantine instructed every one of his men to mark the sign of the Cairo on their shields before they marched into battle there at Milvian Bridge. And Constantine's forces would go on to win the battle. The end result of that being the death of Constantine's competitor to the throne in the west, and Constantine's consolidation of all power in the west under himself. And so from here we go into a time of Constantine coming into his own, so to speak, in terms of becoming a Christian. He doesn't actually, the Battle of Milvian Bridge happens in 312. He doesn't actually profess to become a Christian until 313, after he decrees what we know today as the Edict of Milan, which again guaranteed the legalization of Christianity and that Christians could practice worship freely. But he doesn't actually announce that he's a Christian until after the Edict of Milan, and no one's really sure why he waited till that time, but he did. And then the next several years were spent with him developing into this sort of role as protector of the church, patron of the church, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then kind of coming to a head at the Council of Nicaea, which we'll dig into a little more later on. But that happens at 325. So for about 12 years, Constantine is kind of working on what he's going to end up becoming for the rest of his Christian life, anyway. One of the things that Constantine is best known for is being a patron of the early church. After he won at Milvian Bridge, Constantine took over the role of patron of the Christian faith. He supported the church financially. He had a number of churches built, literally hundreds of churches built. He granted certain privileges to the clergy, like exemption from certain taxes and whatnot. He promoted several Christians to high-ranking offices, not all of the offices. By the time of his death, still two-thirds of the highest offices in the empire were held by pagans, but many in positions of power. He returned property that was confiscated during the last great persecution under Diocletian, and he endowed the church with land and much, much wealth. And then between 324 and 330, Constantine built a new city, essentially, New Rome, at Byzantium, in what is now Istanbul, or what would then become Constantinople, named after him. Unlike the old Rome, or the old Byzantium, the city was built to employ overly Christian architecture. There were churches everywhere. The artwork of the city that abounded was that of Christians. It's not that no other temples could exist, it's just they were dramatically lesser in importance. For the first time, there were city walls, churches in the city walls. And he himself did not build any new temples for any of the other pagan religions. He didn't prohibit it, he just didn't do it himself. And in doing this, actually, as he was less building Constantinople and more converting it from Byzantium to Constantinople, he actually required those who hadn't converted to Christianity to basically, through extremely heavy taxation, pay for the new city. And many historical chroniclers, I guess, tell us that it appeared necessary for Constantine to teach his subjects to give up their old ways, to accustom them to despise their temples and the images contained within them. And this led to the closure of dozens, if not hundreds, of temples across the entire empire, not just Constantinople, because of a lack of imperial support. Their wealth then flowed from where they were to the imperial treasury to then build new churches, or in the case of Constantine later, building more in Constantinople. Constantine, as I said, also elevated several Christians to positions of power throughout the empire. He respected and really admired a particular group of older believers, and elevated them to his court, and it was composed of very respected, honored Christian men, and men from some of the leading Roman families at the time who declined to convert were ultimately denied positions of power. They still received appointments, just not like it would be the difference between getting some kind of appointment out in one of the provinces and being in a position of power in Rome, essentially. And then from the time of his conversion to the time of his death, Constantine's laws that he passed definitely enforced and reflected his very Christian attitudes. He abolished crucifixion for reasons of Christian piety and replaced it with hanging to demonstrate the preservation of Roman supremacy, in his own words. On March the 7th, 321, which was a Sunday, Constantine declared Sundays an official day of rest. Up to this point, Sundays were not sacred in the way that we consider them today to Christians. They were still the Lord's day, but not sacred to the extent that it is now. And they were not only were they not quite as sacred, but they were not sacred and set apart for Christians. Sundays were set apart for the sun god, Sol Invictus, who a lot of times actually would be identified with the Emperor of Rome. And so on Sundays from then on, markets were banned from operating. Public offices were closed except for the purpose of freeing slaves, which is pretty great, honestly. There were no restrictions, though, on performing farm work, which was the great majority of the population on Sundays. And some laws that he made were even humane in the modern sense, and supported tolerance. A prisoner, for example, could not be kept in total darkness, as probably Paul was, if not other Christians, but had to be given access to the outdoors and to daylight. Condemned men were still allowed to die in the arena, whether that was to gladiators, to wild beasts, or whatnot. But contrary to the existing practice of branding them on the face, marking them for death in the arena, um, Constantine changed that. He said that they couldn't be branded on their face because God made man in his image. So instead, you would brand them on the feet, which apparently means feet are not part of God's image, just the face. And then he ordered the elimination of all public gladiatorial games by 325, so around the time of Nicaea. And there are two main ways in which Constantine influenced the church specifically at this time. The first of those was the way he enforced doctrine. And by enforcing doctrine, I mean using the power of the state to enforce widely established Orthodox Christian doctrine. Constantine established a precedent for the position of the Christian emperor in the church, obviously. Emperors before him and emperors after him considered themselves responsible first to the gods and then to God for the spiritual health of their subjects. And after Constantine, the precedent was established that they had a duty to help the church define orthodoxy and maintain it, not to create it, not to say the position of the state is this, ergo the position of the church must be this, but to help them define it. The church generally regarded doctrine as something that bishops needed to define in more localized areas. And so the emperor's role was to enforce that doctrine, to root out heresy, or what was proclaimed to be heresy, and then uphold the unity of the broader church, the ecumenical community. The emperor ensured that God was properly worshipped in his empire. What that looked like in terms of worship and doctrines and dogma was for the church to determine. It was his job to take what they determined and then enforce that on the rest of the empire. Constantine had obviously become a worshiper of the Christian God, but he found that there were many opinions on that worship and indeed on who and what God was at the time. For example, in 316, so after Milan, before Nicaea, Constantine was asked to judge a dispute in North Africa over the Donatists. If you remember the Donatists from last time, they started out refusing to obey any bishops that had caved under persecution, and then eventually came to the conclusion that everyone who wasn't a Donatist bishop wasn't a bishop at all. Excuse me. More significantly, though, as I mentioned at the beginning, and you probably knew about, in 325 he did summon the First Council of Nicaea, which was effectively the first of the ecumenical councils, of which there were 7. Nicaea was the first attempt on a major scale by the broader Christian community to define orthodoxy for the entire church. Up until Nicaea, there had been councils and synods of the church, but they were local, they were regionalized, and they only affected portions of the church. This was part of why it was so easy for heresy to abound in one part of the empire and not in another, because orthodoxy was defined in different ways in different parts. And Nicaea primarily dealt with Arianism. And ultimately they did rule against the Arians as heretics. But Constantine himself was actually pretty torn between the Arians and the Trinitarians, or the Nicene followers, as they're sometimes called. After Nicaea, he did initially banish Arius and his followers. But even though he did that, he did enforce that banishment and enforce the decision of Nicaea for a while, in comes one of his most trusted advisors, who we will discuss at some length today, Eusebius of Nicomedia, who is not the same Eusebius as I mentioned before. That was a church historian. This is a politician, essentially, and then also a bishop later, who was the biggest fan of Arius, if you remember me talking a little bit about him last time. Eventually, Eusebius persuaded Constantine not only to recall him from exile, because he was exiled for about 3 years there, but then also Arius. And Eusebius was also directly responsible later for influencing Constantine to banish Athanasius from the church. In fact, when the story goes that when Constantine recalled Arius from exile, he put the Nicene Creed before him that had been decided on by the majority that were there, and essentially said, "Do you agree with this now?" And in word, he said that he did. And then when Constantine asked him to define it, he basically gave kind of this nebulous non-answer that for Constantine seemed to have been good enough, and so Constantine allowed him back into fellowship with the church. The other hallmark of the church under Constantine was how Constantine sort of actively suppressed other religions. He did allow pagans and Jews to continue to practice their religions, so long as they didn't force Christians to convert or practice with them. And he didn't force non-Christians to convert either. He didn't violently suppress them. There were no pagan martyrs, there were no Jewish martyrs during this time. Ironically, in his eyes, the non-Christian religions had now become superstitio, which was what the Christians were accused of being, or being called, in clinging to this sort of strange, ridiculous religion. So now the Christians who were the superstitio have a Christian emperor who declares everything else superstitio. So he didn't, again, actively encourage persecution of pagans and Jews, but he did speak against their practices. And on multiple occasions, he called for their temples to be pillaged, mainly pagans, sometimes Jews, mainly pagans though. He called for their temples to be pillaged, and then eventually he ordered the destruction of many pagan temples across the empire, which was at least in part designed, honestly, just to steal their wealth, to help build Constantinople. It was far less about, I want all the pagans to burn, and far more about, I need the money for Constantinople. And it does seem possible, given the historical evidence we have, it's debated, but it does seem at least possible, that he may have at one time banned blood sacrifice, a big deal in all pagan religions, at least at that time. And he may have passed some legislation that outlawed magic and divination, also big in the pagan religions at the time. And Constantine, believe it or not, even persecuted some Christian sects, namely the Donatists. Not because he disagreed with them per se. He didn't hate them. He really didn't. Constantine was kind of a simple believer in terms of his understanding of the faith. So it wasn't that he disagreed with them and that's why he persecuted them. He persecuted the Donatists, but then also some other small Christian sects, mainly because they were causing too much trouble. He wanted to enforce some degree of uniform acceptance in terms of matters of the broader church. Again, he viewed it as his job to uphold orthodoxy, to defend, I guess, the decisions of the church, even though he really did not do that particularly well with the aftermath of Nicaea. And we'll talk a little bit about what that resulted in a little bit. And so now we come to a very broad question, and it's the most significantly asked question about Constantine, and that is, was he actually a Christian? This is so intensely debated, namely because I'll say the majority of secular thinkers basically just assume that he couldn't have actually been a believer, either because he was playing the politics game or because he saw this as the easiest way to have peace in the empire. That's one theory that's put forward. There are a number of things that Constantine is accused of in place of being a Christian or being the reason why he identified as a Christian. It is a smidge before 7, but we will go ahead and take our break now. We'll give it a little more time. So it's 6:56, so we'll come back at 7:10, so about 14 minutes. back. And we're honing in again on the big question about Constantine. All the things we've talked about with Constantine ultimately lead to this question, whether you're a believer or not, and that is, was he actually converted? Just before his death in May of 337, um, we're told by the historical record and by tradition that Constantine was fully baptized into the faith. And it took him that long to be baptized because it was a belief held by many Christians at the time that the longer you waited to get baptized, the more sin you could absolve before entering heaven, which seems kind of silly to us now, but it was a big deal to them then. Up until he was baptized, he had been a catechumen for most of his Christian life, which was a catechumen in the Greek is simply a student or a learner. He was baptized by his distant relative and Arian bishop, Eusebius of Nicomedia. The best way to describe Eusebius of Nicomedia is think of the ultimate backroom, wheelin' dealin', slimy politician. That's Eusebius of Nicomedia, and possibly worse. During his time on the imperial court, the East and the major positions in the Eastern Church were all held by Arians or sympathizers with Arius because of Eusebius working on Constantine. And with the exception of just a very short period of time, Eusebius was a completely trusted advisor, both for Constantine and then his son, Constantius II. And then he was also the theology tutor of the emperor after Constantius, which was the Emperor Julian. So after Constantine dies, his son, Constantius II, becomes his successor, and he was an Arian. In fact, 4 of the 5 emperors over the next 50 years after Constantine would be Arians. And so all that to say, we don't really know what Constantine, where he stood in terms of truly being a believer or not, but we do know for certain that his decision to not actually enforce the decision of the Council of Nicaea and do his duty, or at least his duty in his eyes, to root out heresy, in this case Arianism, caused great harm to the broader church across the empire for roughly 50 years or so. Between Nicaea in 325 and its aftermath, and then the eventual succession to the throne of Theodosius the First, which was in 379. Better than half of the bishops and politicians in authority at this time were Arians, and as I said, 4 or 5 emperors were as well. Ironically, the only one who wasn't was Julian, who, even though he was tutored by Eusebius, revived the Roman gods. And all of those Arians in authority, whether it was politically or in the church, succeeded in removing many, many Nicene opponents with the power of the state. Athanasius chief among them, with a couple of other major ones as well. So just as importantly it is to remember that we can't know for sure that Constantine was truly a believer, it is equally important to understand just how important he was to the entire history of the church, but especially to the early church. Excuse me. If you had told a Christian, or even a pagan, in the Roman Empire at this time, anywhere in the empire, that the Emperor of Rome would proclaim that he is a Christian, literally no one would have believed you. 0 people. Because for the pagans, it was incomprehensible to think that the emperor, the most powerful man in the known world, and to the pagans, a living God in his own right, at least his office makes him a living God, would cast aside the old gods, the Roman gods, in favor of, to them, still, this superstitio, this false religion, which is with its twisted practices. To some degree, for many of them, It would almost be the equivalent of you telling them that Zeus had converted to Christianity. Well, for them, Jupiter, but for us, Zeus, we'll say. So the chief of the gods for them had converted to Christianity. That was how big of a deal it was to them. But to the Christians, this was the single most joyous moment since the day of Pentecost in all the history of the church. The most powerful man in the world, a man whose predecessors had reviled and persecuted the faith, and in whose steps he had initially followed, was now one of them, was now on their side. They didn't have to hide anymore. They didn't have to run anymore. They could worship freely for the first time. They could openly worship without fear of repercussions. And now, as Constantine took on the role of patron of the church, they could build real church buildings, in some places for the first time ever. They could compile real, full Bibles, which up to this point had still not been firmly cemented and established. At Nicaea, the canon was completed, so we had our full Old Testament and New Testament. And then from there, under the patronage of Constantine, we were able finally to compile full Bibles for the first time. And most churches and many clergymen were financially supported by the emperor himself in various ways. And so suffice to say, to many Christians at this time, second only to the life and death of Christ himself, this was at the peak of the most significant moments in the history of the Christian faith. So at the end of the day, there are so many things that we can know about Constantine, and there are so many things we can't know about Constantine. We will not know this side of heaven if he was among the saved. But we do know that it was his initial efforts that led to what eventually morphed into the state church model of governance, and in the decline and in some cases death of pagan religions left and right across the empire. And I mean almost all pagan religions. I mean the most significant of those being the oldest ones, the religion of the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans themselves, the oldest religions in the empire, dead. We'll never know if he truly saw the Chi-Rho in that vision before the battle. But we do know that he was a very generous benefactor to the church, who built hundreds of churches and created arguably what you could sort of call the first Christian city when he built Constantinople. We will never know the answer to many things about his legacy, but we do know that much of his legacy accomplished great things, both for the development and for the flourishing of the church, which would largely continue through the actions of his successors and then also through the church itself later on. So Constantine was many things, but I would say with a gospel-bound sort of hope, we would say today that we hope and pray that indeed he was truly saved. Now there were two reasons why we spent an entire evening talking about Constantine, just one person. First, as I have said all along, he was of very high importance to the history of the church, and really the world in general, if you think about it. I mean, it's not to say that the church could not have spread had Constantine never converted, but the ways in which he did things set precedents for both government at the time and then later governments across both parts of Europe, the West and the East, in their relation to the church, and eventually establishing, as I said, that sort of state-church model where the state is the sort of police arm of the church to do the will of the church. And then second, talking about Constantine helps us to set up what we will be discussing for the next two sessions. The ecumenical councils and the creeds, and then the heresies and the errors that made them necessary. Nicaea was both the first of the ecumenical councils, which ecumenical is just a $5 word for church-wide, essentially. And it was also the source of the first broadly accepted Christian creed, the Nicene Creed. From Nicaea, we would have eventually 6 more major ecumenical councils that are recognized by all wings of the church today, and then 2 more creeds of particular significance to us, which we'll dive into. Nicaea, as I said, was called to deal primarily with Arianism, but also with some other issues, and we'll look at that as well. So we'll be taking a look now, then, at what happens now that the church has the freedoms to work out its issues out in the open, and what comes as a result of those efforts, those councils and those creeds. And at this time, the church finally, for the first time ever, in terms of the broader church, has the freedom to define itself. It's not to say that the church had never attempted to define its beliefs or its structure before, but for the first time, they were able to not have to, meet in hiding or under cover of darkness to try to worship and then establish themselves in what they believed. But part and parcel with that freedom to define beliefs is combating beliefs that they thought were wrong. And there were many, many wrong beliefs and errors and heresies in the first 5 or 6 centuries of the church. Having said that, and we'll wrap, I guess, a smidge early, but having said that, I do want to make it known that we won't meet next week. It's Thanksgiving week, so you just take the week to enjoy it as best as COVID restrictions will allow, anyway. Enjoy the time with your family or whoever you have Thanksgiving with. And then when we come back, we will get into the nitty-gritty of the early church and her struggle to define herself. Have a good night.